Good afternoon. I know it's been a long, full day, so if folks need to stand just to stay alert, completely understand if you need to do any deep breathing before we dive into federal advocacy implications in the next 4 years, by all means, you are free to do so. My name is Elizabeth Coates. I am the director of the Homeownership Alliance at NCST. I also lead our federal policy work. You've got some papers on the tables that can kind of describe some of our policy wins. So by all means, please take a look if you're interested in learning more about our efforts. So as we begin, I'm going to start with just a brief introduction to the panelists that we have here. To my left is Sarah Brundage from the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders. She is the president and CEO of NALL and has also served as a senior policy advisor for the White House Domestic Policy Council, as well as a variety of senior roles at HUD. Additionally, Sarah was the senior policy director at Enterprise Community Partners, where she co-led the National Action Campaign to strengthen and increase the low-income housing tax credit. Sarah also serves as a fellow co-chair of the Neighborhood Homes Coalition, where she, along with NCST and the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, the three of us lead in advancing the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act to passage. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks.
To her left is Chloe Granger of the National NeighborWorks Association, or the NNA, where she serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. The NNA is the trade association representing all of the National NeighborWorks Association, or the NeighborWorks organizations, rather, that are made up of nonprofits that are working in all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. She collaborates with the NNA's membership, leveraging collective and strength, and to promote affordable housing to fight economic injustices and inequalities on a national scale. Before Chloe joined the NNA, she was a senior legislative assistant to Congresswoman Lauren Underwood of Illinois' 14th District. Welcome, Chloe. To Chloe's left, we have Chris Rosslow of the Pittsburgh Community Reinvestment Group, or PCRG, where he serves as the policy director. PCRG is a nonprofit representing community-based groups in Western Pennsylvania. PCRG is also a member of NCST's Homeownership Alliance. Chris brings years of experience in various capacities of community development, where he uses his expertise in both the public and private sector to further PCRG's mission, advocating on behalf of overlooked neighborhoods by identifying areas of concern and prioritizing and pushing for policy positions to address them. Welcome, Chris. And to Chris's left, we have Jill Gilbert of Smith NMTC Associates, LLC. And that is where she works as the general counsel and the vice president. And at Smith NMTC Associates, they work with community stakeholders to structure and facilitate the new markets tax credit transactions using strategic models that allow nonprofit developers to create homeownership opportunities. In Jill's tenure with Smith, Jill has been involved with the placement of over $433 million in new markets tax credit allocation and has assisted in exiting transactions totaling almost $400 million. Jill's goal is to spread the word about the transformative economic development implications and results of the new markets tax credit to developers, to families, and communities, particularly with the homeownership outcomes that the new markets tax credit can provide. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
So let's remind ourselves of the state of play. The 2024 general election resulted in Republican control of the Senate, of the House, and of the White House beginning in January 2025. Throughout the campaign cycle, as we've heard throughout the day, as well as in the halls of Congress, affordable housing has become a top priority for both sides of the aisle, both political parties. Lots of promises were made. Now is the time to see who's going to make good on them. And we wouldn't be in this situation were it not for the important work of housing advocates, you all on this stage in particular. So a question for each of you. Let's start the panel the way we might start an advocacy meeting. Tell us in a quick elevator speech about the work that you do and how it informs your policy priorities in the realm of housing. Whoever wants to start.
I'll go ahead. NALL is the National Alliance of banks, CDFIs, and other public, private, and nonprofit lenders, all brought together by our mission to advance affordable housing and equitable community investments. And we're a nonpartisan organization, as we believe affordable housing supply is a nonpartisan issue. So we're focused on advancing bipartisan housing solutions with a focus on public-private partnerships, which is what our membership is modeled around. And NOL's really historically been known as the honest broker, and so we really work with practitioners and policymakers, our members, and just the broader industry to advance solutions that we know will work.
Excellent.
I'll go. We'll just go down the line. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm with the National NeighborWorks Association, or NNA. We're the trade association that represents the close to 250 local nonprofits that do affordable housing and community development work that are chartered organizations of NeighborWorks America. And so they operate across all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, tribal lands, and really they receive direct funding through NeighborWorks America, which is a congressionally chartered national nonprofit that receives direct appropriations, from Congress, and they leverage that appropriation in FY23 to over $10 billion in affordable housing and community development across the country. And that includes, counseling over 100,000 households, on housing and financial preparedness, as well as creating over 16,000 new homeowners. And so, the funding that and support that organizations or membership gets through NeighborWorks America really is the flexibility there of that funding really allows them to, helps them to be innovative. And so, really focused on place-based, local-driven solutions. And so really my job is to elevate their voices and bring them, to DC and help tell their stories. And they make my job very easy with all of the incredible work that they do. And so, member to member in Congress, oftentimes they have a story of the local NeighborWorks organization and they see it on the ground with what they do. And so that really makes it bipartisan effort. And so, our number one priority really is increased resources. Our organizations do a lot with a little, but they could do so much more with more. And so, this political environment sometimes, pushing for more resources it might be a little bit more difficult, but, it's still something we're really, really focused on, and we can, find certainly bipartisan ground there.
Again, my name is Chris Rossolo. Before I get into a little bit about what I do at PCRG, Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania made the news a lot, probably from August till Election Day. And in fact, on Election Day, I was listening to an interview with the chief of police of Pittsburgh talking about detail and security for yet another visit from one of the members of the tickets. And he said at that time there was over 20 visits from each member of the ticket. So we certainly were, the epicenter of the political world, and it's probably why I was invited on this panel.
Not the only reason.
Yeah. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm a proud member of the Homeownership Alliance. I've been at PCRG for roughly 3 years. And PCRG was initially founded in the 1980s to combat redlining policy set up through the Community Reinvestment Act. Since that time, our organization has grown to approximately 65 members, primarily based in the city of Pittsburgh, but we've since expanded outside the city of Pittsburgh into Allegheny County and some other rural areas outside of Allegheny County. I like to think of PCRG as a convener of stakeholders. We convene traditional lenders to hold them accountable on their lending practices. We provide research services to our members, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And my job as the policy director is to take information or make connections at the ground level with our members, who are primarily non-staffed, community-based organizations. So they don't have the resources within their staffs to do a lot of the advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels. So that's just a little bit of my background and what I do.
Thanks. And I'm Jill Gilbert. As Elizabeth said, I'm Vice President General Counsel at Smith & MTC Associates. And we structure transactions using this federal program, New Markets Tax Credits. I know there are a lot of people probably in the audience who know what that is, some may not. The Homeownership Alliance, many of the members of the Alliance have used these New Markets Tax Credits. So our company started basically as the first, basically the first one that used New Markets Tax Credits with homeownership projects. And so we structured those transactions. We also manage the allocation for 2 homeownership-only community development entities, which many of you know very well, Housing Partnership Network and Community Housing Capital. For those of you who may not know them, Housing Partnership Network is a group of, or a network of 100 or so of the higher performing nonprofit developers, housing developers in the country. Community Housing Capital is one of the lending arms of the NeighborWorks organizations. So we do a lot of sort of technical things with those programs, but we are really advocates for using this innovative financing structure for homeownership because we've seen the benefits that it can bring. And just to give a little bit of background, because I know we'll be talking through the questions here about New Markets Tax Credits, it's a federal program that was put into place, if you're not familiar with it, to incentivize investment in low-income communities or distressed communities. And the way that it does that is that the purchase of these tax credits are used as an incentive in a developer's project to drive the conventional investment. So if you look at a transaction, about a third of the project cost that a developer might have will come from the infusion of that tax credit equity, and the other 2/3 are funds that the project or the developer has to bring itself. So it's really an important way that developers, when they're able to access these credits, and it's a pretty competitive and scarce resource, but when they're able to access them, they really can amplify the great work that all these developers are doing. So in our work, we've been able to see, across the country, we've done now, I know Elizabeth was talking about some of the stats, and that's just what I've done since I've been at the company, but our company in total has worked on housing-only transactions with New Markets in the nature of about $630 million worth of transactions. We've worked across the country with about 23 different CDEs, 33 different states, with about 140 or 50 different developers. So we have seen best practices from so many of the developers that are out there. And what it has shown us and what it has really, kind of led us as far as our policy view of things is that homeownership is critical. It's the issue of our time right now. We have to get creative, especially with the election. We've got to get creative with different financing structures. And so our goal and our part of advocacy, little piece of the advocacy, is really to encourage community development entities or CDEs to use their allocation for homeownership projects, to encourage the government and the CDFI fund to continue this program, to make it permanent, and to increase as much what can be done with homeownership and make it known that this small program can be used for homeownership, because so often people think that it can just be used for projects, commercial projects that create jobs and not homeownership. And really, in fact, of the $81 billion that's been authorized of New Markets Tax Credits, only 2% has been used for homeownership projects. So it's a really very underutilized but great tool if it can be accessed. So sorry, that's a lot of information, but just wanted to give you some background on what New Markets Tax Credits are in case you didn't know.
Thank you so much. So much about advocacy is that initial information sharing. Who are you? What do you stand for? What are you passionate about? Who are you representing? And what can the federal government do And sometimes they don't even know, so it's important to provide that context. Question for any and all on the panel. Talk to us about a light bulb moment that you've had recently or maybe just sticks out to you that you might have encountered when engaging a policy member or a lawmaker on the importance of affordable housing. What tactic maybe did you use to lead someone to realizing the importance of housing policy as a key measure to support communities and economic development?
So I think the light bulb moment I have coming out of the administration and returning to advocacy on the Hill, more explicitly, is that the work of the industry over the last, few decades has really been paying off in that speaking to, Republican offices on the Hill 15 years ago was a very different conversation than it is today. And I think that reflects what we saw in the election, that housing affordability is a top issue for voters, and that voters voted largely on their sense of the economy. And so it does really position well the case making around affordable homeownership. I do think a lot of our messaging won't change, but it will lean into some simple truths. And I think all of us in this space have to focus on strategic messaging in the coming years to really humanize what we know and to not, it's the challenge of educating members, but not over indulging in the alphabet soup that we are all familiar with and trying to speak about outcomes and kind of the human and neighborhood and community level benefits. So everyone needs a place to call home. Homes are where jobs go to live. You'll be hearing a lot of that from the Neighborhood Homes Coalition. Affordable homeownership is the American dream. Affordable housing is part of a healthy economy. And not getting too much into kind of how we structure, and how we weave different, forms of federal government assistance, but really saying these outcomes are made possible because of X, Y, and Z, and state and local government and nonprofit and private partners need a strong federal partner to make these things possible. So I think, I guess my light bulb moment was, we're there, we've made it. It's really about continuing this bipartisan momentum and making sure that we're in a package and this comes to a larger fiscal policy debate, I think.
Great. Other light bulb moments that you all might have encountered?
I can definitely piggyback on Sarah and kind of agree and say, and I'm relatively new to this position. I came off the Hill and have been here for closing in on a year. But, I feel like a lot of that sort of pre-work has been done for me for, this moment. I've been really struck, when I meet with congressional staff or talk about, what their bosses are working on. There are so many housing bills coming and out there. And, I think some are really great and some maybe aren't so great. And some of them are just kind of a big package of things pulled together, and a lot of it is because they want to be doing something on housing. They're going into an election. They want to be able to look at, talk to their constituents and point, hey, this is what I'm proposing or I'm working on, and really I think that shows an energy to get something done. And so, it's just up to us to kind of harness it, direct it, point people in the right direction, organize all the great people in our networks across the country to kind of get it over the finish line and come together on solutions. And I do have kind of one example of sort of how I think things have changed that really struck me is we have a member organization that didn't maybe have the best relationship with their local representative. Many years prior, they had kind of had an interaction with this congressperson that kind of gave them this sense that they didn't really believe in their mission, and maybe they saw their work as kind of a handout. And so I think had not really engaged with that relationship, but this member happened to be pretty important. So, we worked with them to re-engage, and that was not the case at all anymore. They were very, very interested to learn what they were up to, what they were doing, bring them out to, a development they were doing that was building affordable housing right by, some major employers that were coming in to the, the congressperson's district. And, it really, there was no real resistance there anymore. There was a desire and to learn more and to help. And so I think that that kind of journey is really shows that we're in a good place, despite maybe some uncertainty and recriminations about the election, that there are members on both sides of the aisle and in state houses and in Congress that have energy and want to do something on this issue.
I think the light bulb just went off. No, I think sticking to the same theme is the spirit of bipartisanship. I learned when I was working in government, no matter how sort of toxic or damaging the political discourse is, once you're representing your constituents, once you're in that government office, it really doesn't matter what party you're from. You're serving the same folks, whether it's rural, urban areas, you name it. I learned that lesson, working in a government office during the foreclosure crisis, for example, where in 2007, 2008, we didn't ask what party you were from. If there were resources available, we would try to connect you to those resources. I'm still finding that spirit of bipartisanship in this work I'm doing in the advocacy world. So I say this by I guess saying I have faith that no matter what happens in the next couple months with the new administration, with the new Congress, at the end of the day, no matter how many nasty things were said, I think, Sarah mentioned, home ownership, housing issues were at the forefront of the dialogue and discussion during the campaign, and I think that's going to stay the same. So I don't know if it's one light bulb, but it's a continuing theme that I see.
Excellent.
I'd echo, I think, what everybody said, but I really did have a light bulb moment a couple of weeks ago at a conference. And it's sort of the strategic messaging that you were talking about, Sarah, where I think we so often have talked about home ownership and the benefits to the family, obviously, the, racial inequity, the racial wealth gap, intergenerational wealth, the asset that a homeowner has, trying to convince people of that, which I know it's very nice to be in a space like this where, that's, everybody understands that here. But I think what we haven't focused on enough is talking about it in terms of just not the benefits to the homeowner, but the benefits to the community. It's economic development. It brings, employers in who wouldn't come into an area because, there's no, they don't have a workforce there. So I think part of what we are trying to do more is put it in terms of it's economic development. It's not just a home for a homeowner. It's much more than that. And so we're really trying to change our messaging a lot, and it really is trying to be much more strategic about the way that we present it to different people.
Excellent. That feeds in very nicely to our next question about the importance of homeownership policy. If you couldn't gather at NCST, our policy practice, we are committed to informing federal lawmakers on the importance of homeownership in solving our nation's affordability challenges. So Jill, you set it up great, talked about why homeownership is so important. So I'll kick it to the rest of the panel and open it up also, not only why homeownership, but why is it important for the federal government to remain involved?
Well, the federal government's always had a role with spurring homeownership, most historically with the mortgage interest deduction. But I think we're seeing now that we have a shortage of supply, whether it's for renters or homeowners, and that contributes to inflation, and that's a big part of our economy. But I think we need to all continue making the case that the federal government has an important role to play in the whole kind of spectrum of needs for Americans, whether it's those at risk of experiencing homelessness, to low-income renters, to now more and more we talk about middle-income housing, and then yes, to households who are prepared to pursue homeownership. And again, that long narrative of the American dream, but really it is about wealth building and generational wealth, and those are values that resonate across the aisle. So,
yep, absolutely. Chris, PCRG is the beneficiary of a number of federal housing programs. In what ways do you see federal policy shape the homeownership outcomes in your community? And are there any specific programs that have been particularly advantageous for families in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, there are. But I also, when I hear that, I also go back to how important it is to connect the federal programs that are already there and in place at the local level. I can't emphasize that enough. I'm not saying that new programs aren't needed. Sarah did an amazing job sort of going through some of the history of why federal government and federal programs are necessary for home ownership. So part, and it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity I look at every day when I'm working with membership and communities, is connecting those existing resources right now. New market tax credits is a great example. It's extremely expensive to apply and manage and administrate. There's other government programs that are extremely expensive, and finding those resources to help connect, I think, is a priority of mine and the organization.
Thanks, Chris. And I'll remind the audience too, both in person and online, the other sheets of paper you have on your table, there's that QR code where you can scan and submit a question. I'll also very tactfully tell my friends backstage I forgot the iPad has access to the questions. So at whatever point, I'll just really casually grab that up here so I can actually see what those questions are once y'all have them. So obviously you have time before we hit that part of the line of questioning. Let's talk about some local examples that are informing federal interventions. Some of the most effective federal programs are policy reforms that we've seen that have been scaled from the local community-based initiatives. Chloe, I know a NeighborWorks organization in your network has elevated best practices for owner-occupied repair that not only led to a successful state program, but also helped shape federal legislation that's currently under consideration in Congress. So talk to us about the Whole Home Repairs Act and the importance of elevating practitioner experiences and perspectives when designing federal policy.
Yeah, so, I think probably don't really need to harp on it here, but I think in our conversations about the housing shortage and the need for the construction of millions of new units, we can't forget about the importance of preserving the homes that we already have, and there are millions and millions that are at risk of really falling into a level of disrepair to where they are no longer viable, and of course also preserving the homeowners that are already homeowners, and so we kind of have to walk and chew gum at the same time there. And so I think where a lot of these solutions can come from is from local organizations working at the local level and identifying problems and gaps and solutions. And so a great example of that is one of our network organizations, NeighborWorks Northeastern Pennsylvania. We love Pennsylvania here. They really have been running a aging in place and home repair program in the state of Pennsylvania. But home repair, as some may know, is very difficult to kind of it's very difficult to stand up those programs. There's a myriad of the alphabet soup of federal programs, and you know, a lot of them are pretty broad in their usage, and so you know, the competition for funding does not really leave a lot of space for home repair, or there's some very specific weatherization, energy efficiency, home repair, lead abatement programs, but they're very tailored. And so, you know, the NeighborWorks organization identified a need to really kind of set up a one-stop shop, some flexible funds to sort of weave everything together and address the repair needs of the whole home. Some folks might qualify for some weatherization, but you know, they have faulty plumbing and so can't unlock that funding, and you know, it's when they need a new roof and a ramp, sometimes you can't do that all at the same time. And so they you know, worked with their state legislators to set up a state program to set up these one-stop shops, and you know, really administered that in Pennsylvania for several counties, and to great success, and got the attention of, you know, their senators in Congress. So Senator Fetterman, you know, members of Congress love to look to their communities for solutions, and so that kind of collaborative relationship brought about a bill in Congress to, you know, kind of scale this up, have a pilot program through HUD on the national level. And so we're, you know, NeighborWorks Northeastern Pennsylvania work closely with Fetterman's office, NNA, some other of our partners, and you know, we're very happy that it's a bipartisan bill. Senator Lummis and Senator Fetterman are leads on that, and this week on the House side, Representative Flood and Nikema Williams are going to introduce the House companion, and so it's just one piece of a very, very big puzzle. But you know, it's these kind of local solutions trickling up that we, you know, really, you know, want to identify and facilitate. And I know, you know, everyone on this panel is involved in that.
If I can add, because that's great. So one of our members, Action Housing, which is a housing services nonprofit developer, actually managed the whole home funds coming into Allegheny County. And that program was critical, but a couple things is, if that program was elevated to a federal scale, there's been some recent studies that show that the housing stock in Pennsylvania is some of the oldest in the country. And to give you an idea, was it 2 or 3 years ago, it was passed in the Pennsylvania budget through American Recovery Act money. It was I want to say it was probably $150 million, which isn't a lot for $1 billion problem statewide. And the whole home repairs program wasn't funded the last 2 years in the state budget. So you mentioned those opportunities at the federal level. That's a great example that would benefit our local communities.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, you know, that was kind of the American Rescue Plan funding was sort of the impetus for being able to stand up this program. And while maybe pointing to ARPA money, you know, right now politically might not be, you know, what you want to highlight, I think it's still important that that was kind of a rare big infusion of funds to, you know, state and local governments. Like, we need to be looking around and seeing what they did with those. Can we find ways to extend it once that funding's out, or, you know, scale it up to the national level? But maybe, you know, depending on who you're talking to, you don't have to say who signed the bill that brought that money around.
Yeah. And certainly good to tell federal legislators at any point what works, regardless of where the resources come from. That's certainly something that I will always encourage, and it's been great advocating with you, Chloe, and we had the meeting with Representative Flood, and then a few days later we're able to learn his support of the legislation achieving a bipartisan and bicameral approach. So it can and can still will happen. Sarah, how are state and local housing supply efforts informing some of these policies and programs that we're seeing at the national level? And how can federal departments better address barriers to developing affordable housing?
Yeah, I think when we think about local supply policy, we're going to think mostly about zoning and land use, and which are very much local issues. HUD released pro-housing grants, which were awarded to localities making progress in removing barriers to development, such as land use. And I think that was a really great model for how the federal government has a role to play, even with local policy, in terms of incentivizing the best practices. But also to kind of build off this thread, the state and local fiscal recovery funds allowed for that flexibility to do a range of housing and homelessness programs. And I think the 2 points to make there are, one, regardless of the political pendulum, we need to always encourage policymakers to not start from scratch. And when things work, it doesn't matter who signed the bill. We also know that a lot of our policies that Congress enacted as part of relief during the pandemic really provided resources to reduce homelessness, to increase supply. And, I think I would argue that we're still in the same housing crisis. And we saw when the emergency housing vouchers, ended, that we saw a spike back in homelessness, and I think we'll similarly see some challenges when the state and local fiscal recovery funds are done. And so, I think, I guess I would encourage not to shy away from bringing up where it was enacted. I wouldn't, rub it in someone's face for political reasons, for sure. But I think it's important to say, hey, this passed and this did help in your community. And, we have to commit to having this issue rise above the politics, I think.
And we're seeing that even with a letter penned from a number of House Republicans to Speaker Johnson to say these Inflation Reduction Act provisions and some of these energy credits, please make sure that we don't rescind those because of the job creation they're able to create within our districts. If we can ensure that we've got housing programs that are delivering on the same message, I think we will not be in nearly as dire of a situation that maybe some folks might assume because the upcoming congressional and White House makeup. Because there's lots of opportunities, because these are the constituents at the end of the day. And like Chris said, no one's asking who you voted for when you're coming to ask for housing assistance. Or if they are, they're probably not doing their job very well. So Chris, and you talked a little bit about kind of the impacts of the whole home repair that you're seeing in your communities. How does the policy and research work of PCRG's staff, of your members, and of your partners inform policy making? Are there any practices or programs that you currently have in place that you feel have the potential to be scaled up at the federal level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really proud of the research that our organization produces. I think it's our bread and butter. We recently just came out with our 28th annual mortgage lending study, where we took home mortgage data and put it in a form where we listed the top 50 lenders within this year's study. Actually includes the entire region. And that study and the numbers in that study will equip communities to hold lenders accountable, hold local government accountable, you name it. We were able to start a responsible banking ordinance through that initiative, where we were able to lay out to local government the performances of lenders, where their deposits were, how much, how many mortgages were being loaned out, to help equip them with the data necessary to make responsible decisions. One recent report I think of was, and this has been mentioned numerous times today, is the institution, or the corporate purchasing of single-family homes. We saw a rise in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County from 2010 to 2020, almost 10%. So taking that information, knowing that there's legislation out there, Senator Brown, Senator Fetterman on the Stop Predatory Investment Act, that's going to help our communities in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. And so through that research, I think it's really imperative to equip our neighborhood groups, our community leaders with that information.
Yeah. And that information provides further justification for as much support as possible.
Yep.
That's great. Jill, as you have mentioned, and as we know, and the reason why we have you here on the stage, also your work expertly leverages an economic development program, New Markets Tax Credit, to support for-sale housing in low-income communities. So how have you seen the local examples shape the federal perspectives of New Market's potential? And where are you seeing those examples take place? Maybe a community where this is working really well through the homeownership model, or a neighborhood, or a recent project that you all have completed?
Well, so since we have worked across the country and have worked with so many really great, high-performing, sophisticated developers, we do see a lot of great things. And what we always tell them is, anytime you have a ribbon cutting, a groundbreaking, a wall raising, a key ceremony for a new homeowner, anytime you have anything like that, you need to let the legislators know that. You need to invite them. You need to make sure it's clear to them. Because so often the legislators know there's this great project in their area, but they don't know that it was funded with New Markets. They don't know that, they don't know the background on it. So that's one thing where we definitely always try and make it clear. Everybody, scream it from the rooftops, whatever you need to do, let everybody know that New Markets tax credits are what we're behind this project. And so we've seen just those relationships because, I can do a lot here or I can do a little sitting on this stage saying things, but, they're the ones who are doing all this work. So they're the real evidence of what the program can do and what the government has done in funding this program or authorizing the program is really from looking at what all the projects are. But the one thing that I wanted to mention in connection with this is when we had the CDFI fund actually come out and visit with Community Housing Capital and wanted to understand how Community Housing Capital operationalizes their New Markets Tax Credit Program for homeownership. And so it really gave kind of a background glimpse of, what are they looking at when they're looking at the actual project, when they're looking at how the program is set up. But they contacted Community Housing Capital and said, okay, we're going to come out. Nobody really likes to get a call from the CDFI fund that says they're coming out for a full-day visit. They came, they sent 2 agents, they sent a whole list of documents that they wanted to see about how Community Housing Capital approved the developers, that they're all NeighborWorks organizations, obviously, all doing great things, but how they approved the allocation that they allocated to these projects and why they did that, what their credit memos looked like, what were the impacts they were expecting, what were the neighborhoods, why were they chosen, just really, really detailed information. And I was lucky enough to be part of the meeting when they came out. And they really went through they had a whole agenda they wanted to cover. And, as we had a whole day, visit with them. So as you would, you start talking about other things, sports, the weather, whatever. And they would always come right back to the agenda because they had things they wanted to cover and they wanted to be informed. And one of the things they said was, why do we think more CDEs and investors don't use their allocation for homeownership? And we told them because a lot of people think you can't do that, or they think that you can do it technically under the statute, but it's not something that the CDFI fund really favors. And they were surprised by that and said, that's not the case, that's not what we think. They wanted to know, we had one of NHS Baltimore, Dan Ellis, who we love, was there. He did a great presentation on his project and what he did with New Markets, and it was such a clear evidence of just the boots on the ground informing, the people who really can make a difference in some of these programs about what can be done. And so whether it was a result of that or not, I don't know, but the next allocation that just came out in September, all three of the homeownership-only CDEs, Habitat International, HPN, and CHC, received allocation, and that's the first year that that's ever happened. So once again, goes to that point of amplify what you're doing, make sure legislators know, make sure the people in power who can make those decisions know, because it can make a difference.
Let's stick with tax policy, because who doesn't want to keep talking about that at 4:15 in the afternoon? 2025 is a big year for tax, as the provisions enacted in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire at the end of next calendar year. With that in mind, Congress has already begun to consider what items that they want included in a forthcoming bill, especially now that Republicans have control of all three levers that will determine perhaps what that looks like. This is a tremendous opportunity for our lawmakers to prioritize affordable housing in any changes to the tax code. So Sarah, we do not yet have a federal tax credit that focuses solely on the development and rehabilitation of affordable homeownership units. So please tell us about the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. How would it work? Who are the beneficiaries? What's the impact on homeownership? And what's the plan to get this bill done?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, it proposes a new tax credit modeled off of the successful low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, in that it's a public-private partnership. But as Elizabeth said, this one is specifically designed to help finance the production and substantial rehab of modest single-family homes for owner occupancy homeownership. Like these other P3 models, it is administered at the state level. Sponsors receive the tax credits and can exchange them for capital from investors to then make possible this homeownership supply. I want to just take a step back and share with the audience a bit about the kind of potential path forward for neighborhood homes and the very likely path forward for the tax Super Bowl, my favorite topic. So with the Republican trifecta, we anticipate Congress to pick up, they first have to pass appropriations, and then they can pursue reconciliation, which will allow them to make budget adjustments with a slimmer margin. The primary policy on the table is the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which in of itself has a price tag of over $4 billion. So the Republicans are going to have to really grapple with their fiscal policy goals and and how that works with tax policy goals. This sets the stage for them needing to identify major pay-fors for this tax package, which is why, clawing back funding from the Inflation Reduction Act is a hot topic, why it's important to have bipartisan support for all key appropriations and certainly newer sources of funding so that you can have champions. So I think the question here is, what bells and whistles will be able to ride onto this package? And we're doing everything we can in partnership with so many others here to say that Congress cannot pass a tax package without providing meaningful relief to renters and homeowners. We have two kind of key bipartisan proposals that the industry has coalesced around. It's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act on the rental side and having key provisions to strengthen and expand the low-income housing tax credit, and it's the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act on the homeownership side. I think also on the table are opportunity zones, and I think a lot of us, Null included, are interested in what reforms to that tax credit could take place to help it, really achieve that original bipartisan intention of, again, attracting private capital for meaningful community development. I think the challenge there will be the ability to make reforms to opportunity zones in a reconciliation setting, since everything has to have a budgetary impact. So I think, right now, Senate Republicans have said they would like to see a tax package passed by April 30th. I think that will be a hard goal to achieve, but this is something that I would expect Congress to pass before the July 4th recess. And so it's a first 6 months play. And so, housing advocates are mobilizing, and we're going to do our part to make sure, again, we're beating that drum. Neighborhood Homes has a slightly more uphill pathway than perhaps the low-income housing tax credit, in that it's a new tax credit. That being said, it is, again, building off of successful models, and the call for affordable home ownership supply is, I think, a top issue. So we're seeing a lot of positive reactions from the Hill. We just got Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina to co-sponsor the bill, which was, I think, a huge accomplishment of the coalition. The senator is slated to be the chair of the Banking Committee, and he also sits on the Senate Finance Committee since this is a tax provision. And Representative Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania is the House Republican lead of the House bill. He also chairs the tax subcommittee of House Ways and Means. And so again, we have really strong bipartisan support, and I think it's about really never taking your foot off the pedal of that message of relief for renters and homeowners alike.
Excellent. And to continue to hyper-focus on Pennsylvania, we love all 50 states and additional territories the same.
It's actually a commonwealth.
Rather, yes, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So PCRG, you all have been such great local partners and proponents of the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Talk about how you see that tax credit really transforming the communities that you serve.
Yeah, no, we love the neighborhood homes tax credit. We look at it as sort of one of the missing pieces at the federal level that doesn't exist. Sarah mentioned the successful low-income housing tax credit program for rental properties, rental housing, and heavily utilized, oversubscribed. But again, going back to the lay of the land in Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh is old housing stock, a lot of older homeowners who want to stay in their homes, but the condition of the homes are getting to the point where they need rehab. And you sort of have a lot of those middle neighborhoods, where are sort of on the cusp of on decline and needing some attention. So we're really excited. Sarah mentioned Congressman Kelly as the lead sponsor in the House. He's right up north of us in Butler County and the Erie area. And we talked about bipartisanship and maybe some unlikely partners. And, my congresswoman is Congresswoman Summer Lee, who's probably, if you were to take two members of Congress and say, stick them on the opposite sides, it would be Summer Lee and Mike Kelly. But my conversations with Congresswoman Lee have been productive about it because she, again, knows that it's needed in her district, in her community. So we see it on the ground level, and that's why we're really excited about it. And so Sarah, I took really detailed notes. You gave a great update, so.
Excellent. Thanks for your advocacy there, Chris. So Jill, next year's tax negotiations also present a good opportunity to extend the authority of the New Markets Tax Credit. You talked a little bit earlier about the importance of making this permanent. What are the benefits for Congress making this a forever program?
Sure, and the benefits would be huge for the program. They really would. So just to give you an example, since the inception of the program in 2000, and after the initial enactment, there were 2 one-year extensions, 2 two-year extensions, followed by a 1-year extension, a 5-year extension, another 1-year extension, and now a 5-year extension that expires next year. So there's never been any kind of permanency. It has just been, just joined that way by each extension. And so it's very hard to develop a full program when you don't know if it's going to be there next year or in 2 years. And so where we see this, it's the CDEs who are applying for allocation, as you kind of alluded to get your administration around applying for a program. That's a little bit of a ramp up. So CDEs, do they have somebody on staff who actually is just dedicated to that or not? For the investors, looking at what their investors' appetite is. But I think the real beneficiaries of permanency would be the developers, because so often there are good projects that are out there, but they need some time to develop. And if you have a program that's only been authorized for 1 year, when CDEs are looking to put their allocation into projects, they can't wait and put it into a project 3 years from now. It has to be, deployed now. Also, there's some developers that are out there, kind of emerging developers, so they need time to get a track record together. They need time to get kind of the financial profile that you have to have in order to meet the requirements for the New Markets Tax Credit Program. So I think if we can get permanency, that would be great really for the developers, and it would be great just for homeownership in general.
Thank you. And Chloe, are there tax credits or initiatives that either been mentioned here or maybe some additional ones that would really benefit the NeighborWorks organizations that you serve and represent?
I don't really have too much to add to what, the kind of the great updates provided by my co-conspirators up here. And so NNA is ready to take marching orders on the low-income housing tax credit, neighborhood homes, new markets, and we have been, but we know the Super Bowl, tax Super Bowl is coming up, and so we're very focused on those as kind of our utmost priorities. Of course, with thinking about the reconciliation package, we obviously have some concerns about what the pay-fors could be, and so we don't want it to come on the backs of our organizations of the funding that they rely on through the federal government. So we'll be looking at that. And of course, also there are other tax provisions that do have major implications for the communities that we serve, the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit. While not directly related to housing, we do see those as such a critical piece of really supporting our communities.
Thank you. For the panelists, just so you all know, I'm going to jump to a section a little further down just because I want to make sure that our audience is able to hear this discussion. I want to discuss 3 challenging and intersecting issues: disaster relief, insurance, and climate change. We're seeing the devastation caused by Hurricanes Helene and Milton, droughts and wildfires on both coasts, and subsequently the severe impact these natural disasters have on communities around the country. Question for the entire panel: what can the federal government do to improve disaster resiliency programs to ensure that aid is efficiently flowing through the agencies and down to the neighborhoods that are in dire need of relief?
Easy. Reform and permanently authorize the CDBG-DR, or Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This is HUD's primary tool for helping communities rebuild post-disaster, rebuild their housing. And currently, every time that there's a federally declared disaster, Congress has to reconvene to pass supplemental disaster funding. This is something that is potentially going to happen in this lame duck session. We could see some supplemental disaster recovery, low-income housing tax credits, and new markets tax credits passed for the impacted states, which would be Florida and North Carolina, from these most recent hurricanes. But again, Congress has to come back into session, has to vote and pass. The bipartisan proposal to permanently authorize and reform CDBG-DR would allow for forward funding so that HUD could act more quickly. And I think it's important to distinguish the role that FEMA plays from the role that HUD plays, and again, that disaster recovery with housing to longer-term resilience efforts. And we know that CDBG-DR is the primary tool that, again, we help renters and homeowners alike get back on their feet post-disaster.
And I'll just add to that. I think that Sarah really covered it. That's absolutely the number one issue as far as, especially housing, post-disaster recovery. Just the ad hoc nature of how that's been happening just creates insane delays, which, has major economic repercussions for those communities. And I would be remiss if I didn't just toot the horn of NeighborWorks. They, in the wake of Helene and Milton, even in a CR, were able to get emergency funding out to the organizations that were impacted, that were in communities that were impacted. And so, just like kind of immediate work that, they're already in the communities. They have their own needs that, their properties, et cetera, that were impacted. And also they're just ready to go to serve their communities. And, when it takes a long time for that money to come down, sometimes, we're thinking of long-term recovery, but also that immediate immediate need. And so just, you know, continuing to push Congress to permanently authorize and set up more, you know, permanent streams for resources to quickly get to communities. And I think we have to think of our, you know, mission-driven organizations on the ground that are, you know, doing, you know, community development work already. Like, how can we get funds as quickly to them as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I would concur on the block grant funding as being a critical component. Some of the other things that you know we're seeing in communities and on the ground that sort of the proactive nature when you're looking at climate change and some of the impacts. You know, you take a community like Pittsburgh, you know, topography-wise, a lot of hillsides. We have a landslide problem. And it's straining our local and county budgets, and it just makes the costs higher for housing. It's just a fact. So, you know, we're nervous that we're gonna maybe possibly see some of those federal resources be clawed back to pay for some other things. You know, there's that debate, of course, but that's sort of the proactive that we need to continue to help support, you know, our local governments in building that infrastructure up.
And just as far as new markets are concerned, as well as Sarah kind of said, there is a carve-out that's being, you know, pushed forward that would allow those funds, like you were saying, Chloe, to get down to the developers who actually can get those placed as quickly as possible. The first time that new markets and home ownership were used together was after there was a special allocation after Hurricane Katrina and Rita. And so it was a GO zone only allocation that was put out by the CDFI fund. And so that had, you know, tremendous effects in addressing, you know, the issues that we're facing again now.
And I'll note that the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act does also cover presidentially declared disaster areas as well. So it would be a good proactive approach. So call your member of Congress and make sure that they're on board. Let's talk about the rising insurance costs and how that's placing a significant strain on the affordable housing sector. Insurers are pulling out of certain communities, in some cases entire states, due to natural disaster risks. Some affordable housing providers are even seeing their premiums skyrocket, and insurers are describing affordable housing and community development work as inherently risky. So, question for the panel: how are these insurance challenges appearing in the communities, either that you serve as an individual organization or the organizations you represent? And how are you weaving, if at all, those concerns into your federal advocacy efforts?
I think rising insurance is the contemporary existential crisis for the affordable housing industry. It is one of, I mean, I think this is part of a larger policy conversation about how various policy goals and challenges always fall on the back of developers, and ultimately, you know, the households we're serving are the ones who suffer. And I think the challenge, you know, at a high level with this is that the insurance industry is regulated at the state level. And so I think many folks in the industry are putting their heads together to try to come up with a strategy. But while we need longer term reform and stability, we also need some short-term relief to help near to finish projects really get there. You know, we're hearing about insurance premiums going up 400% in a year. You know, you're hearing about entire, you know, census tracts, counties, states, you know, denying insurance to both multifamily developers, but also single-family homeowners. I think, you know, one, this feeds into the affordable housing supply conversation that, you know, elected officials need to understand how hard it is to pencil things out right now. And this is not the time to cut back resources that make capital stacks possible. But also, you know, I will make the pitch, I think a lot of us need to make the pitch that Congress should consider, HUD should consider a multifamily relief fund for near to finish projects that would provide really flexible gap financing to help offset things such as rising insurance costs. But a lot of work and policy development to be done around that, but I'd love to hear how folks are seeing it in their backyard, because I hear about it at, the 1,000-foot level.
Yeah, no, we talk about capital stacks, and from a developer standpoint, we have a minority developers table that we help provide technical assistance for, and building those stacks. It's more important, or it's more expensive to lend and borrow, and your building material costs are higher, but taking those insurance costs even more so. A lot of folks just don't think about it, right, when you're putting that together. So I'll be the first to admit, there's definitely more work to do. I don't know what the solution is, but as we continue to battle the climate crisis, particularly in underserved areas where investment's hard enough to come by, that's a problem.
And I would also just piggyback that we have to stay really sharp when it comes to looking at the data about what trends we're seeing, because I do think rising insurance is tied to disasters, but it's also tied to racial equity, because we're also seeing rising insurance being kind of a modern version of redlining. And I think we're going to all need that data to prove that, to demonstrate that there is potentially a disparate impact. And, I think this is a trend we can't, sleep on here.
I think we have a research project coming up.
All right. We're also at the Urban Institute.
And I see some researchers
Let's collaborate.
Yes.
CoreLogic. Sorry to call it Michael
National
over there.
prowess and locally
Yeah,
informed.
there you go.
Look at all of us
Great to have some
convening.
data.
Yes, to further empower advocacy efforts around this. Since we're talking a little bit about climate change too, it's one that can, of course, be politically contentious, but for anyone involved in affordable housing and homeownership work and community development work, you understand that the impacts of climate change do not discriminate based on political affiliation. So, you all, as advocates, how do you elevate concerns and solutions to mitigate the climate crisis to bipartisan audiences?
I thankfully have found that the kind of rhetoric has died down a bit. I had the privilege of taking a trip to Alaska when I was at HUD, and Alaska's a red state. We were with Senator Murkowski, and there was just no question of it. Obviously, some states aren't quite there, because in Alaska, you can visibly see climate change. But to a point that was made earlier, no one's asking who you voted for or what, whether this is about climate change or not, when senators are going to Congress asking for disaster recovery relief. And a lot of these disasters happen in the Southeast, they happen in the Midwest. It's not just fires in California, it's really everywhere. I think, though, the messaging to rely on is, again, about disaster recovery, about rebuilding local economies. We don't have to get into a climate change debate when an entire community has just been wrecked or is underwater or is without power. So I thankfully feel like this is less of a hot topic as it used to be.
I mean, it was encouraging to hear now, I guess, Vice President-elect Vance during the debate really sort of acknowledge just that, right? Like I guess he didn't deny climate change, but he also sort of acknowledged the fact that, it's impacting communities, right? Yeah. So let's not argue about the, how's it impacting the local communities. So it's encouraging.
Yeah, I to kind of go on a slight tangent, when I was on the Hill, I also covered agriculture and met with a lot of farmers, and they spoke, despite often coming from pretty conservative backgrounds, they talked about climate change all the time because, they could speak with authority on it because the weather and climate was their business, and they'd been doing it for a long time, and they can tell the story of exactly how it's impacting them. And I think that story resonates, maybe not with every single person depending on their beliefs, but with most certainly members of Congress. Again, we're talking about the economic impacts of disasters and climate change. And so, I think affordable housing developers and community development professionals can kind of speak with the same type of authority because they're also seeing it in their communities. And another thing that I would say farmers did well was really talk about kind of it. I don't want to use the word business opportunity, but the economics of some of these incentives and innovations in green energy and carbon sequestration and really how it's a driver of the local economy. And so, I think we can borrow certainly a little bit from that playbook, and I think that is what's going on now. And I agree. I think when you center those conversations kind of in that realm, certainly, I think there is a risk of some of this Inflation Reduction Act money being clawed back for tax cuts and to pay for whatever tax reconciliation bill. So, if those credits are important, that funding is important, I think, kind of telling that story in that frame, can be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that if you're keeping an eye on the news that you might see a lot coming from perhaps the incoming administration is regulations, and how it is that I'll put my neutral spin on it. How is it that federal programs can work better, and how can the dollars flow more easily to grantees and impact communities? And we've actually seen a lot of activity from federal agencies seeking to reform their housing policies in efforts to make them more efficient. And CST has submitted over a dozen comment letters this year alone advising on how the executive branch can use its administrative powers to better support homeownership. Chloe, HUD's Home Investment Partnership Program, is one of the key resources used by nonprofit housing organizations to construct affordable homes. HUD released a long-awaited rule. You all know, those of you in here, I know we were waiting a long time for them to be able to make regulatory improvements, particularly for homeownership. What does the NNA hope to see out of either the final rule, should we see it come forth, or just the next regulatory action in the home program under HUD?
Sure, yeah. So, as I'm sure most folks here know, home is kind of the largest, source of federal funding for specifically for housing, that we have. And for the NeighborWorks network, after NeighborWorks America funding, it is the most important source of direct federal funding. And so, the rule was definitely long awaited, and I can say, Elizabeth and I, are a part of a group called the Coalition for Affordable Homeownership, and we certainly spent many hours this summer digging through the long rule, and really, I think overall we were really pleased to see, kind of, I think the experience of the home program, recently has been, just. Is the juice isn't worth the squeeze. It's so burdensome to administer and to comply with that we would see organizations kind of pull out from using home funds because of that. And so we did see a lot of. It really seems that HUD kind of listened to many of those concerns, especially. Kind of a category of that is for the community housing developer organizations, the CHODOs. Those requirements, they really, I think, made a great effort to ease some of the toughest ones, especially with an eye for rural areas and smaller organizations. While trying to still protect sort of the integrity of the program. And that's, I think, especially important here because the CHODOs are the ones, I think, really doing the home ownership work in using, the home program. And so, there was some other, I think, great things in the bill, in the rule, trying to, increase the per unit subsidy. I think there were some places where we would like to see it go further. I know there's the 95% median purchase price limitation that, I think HUD is, saying that statutorily they can't do anything with, and we, I think, recognize that home really needs to be reauthorized and retooled for the present market and looking forward. But I think we're hoping that maybe there's some relief they can provide to make that limitation more workable for organizations doing home ownership work on the ground. So we are eagerly awaiting, potentially they might get a final rule out, before they leave. I don't know if I'll hold my breath, but, certainly I think that this kind of work of streamlining programs is something that we can continue into the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Jill, your organization has identified a number of actions that Treasury can take on its own without Congress to improve New Market's tax credit usability for homeownership. What are some of those recommendations that you would like to see from the department to better support the work that you all do?
Well, and actually we had a nice couple successes today because the application for New Markets Tax Credit, the new application dropped today. So we had been, advocating and canvassing with different letters that we submitted in connection with the Homeownership Alliance as well about different things. And they took a couple of those and actually implemented them, which is really nice. You don't often see that, the kind of automatic, very clear path of we suggested it, they did it. So it was very nice. But anyway, it's the same idea of people in the new markets world don't think you can use new markets for home ownership. So it's just socializing, having the Department of Treasury and the CDFI fund and the materials that they put out, just socializing the idea, giving examples of home ownership developers when they're, in the FAQs or when they're providing information on things. Actually, in the application, they didn't end up doing this, and they did actually, I'll step back a second, in the FAQs that came out with the application today, they actually do have a homeownership example, and in the PowerPoint that describes new markets, they actually, one of the Qualic B is the entity that receives the funding. It's the developer, basically. In describing different types of Qualic Bs in the PowerPoint they sent out, one is a for-profit homeownership, or not for-profit, a for-sale developer, homeownership developer. So that's awesome as well. But other things that I don't think the CDFI fund specifically or the Department of Treasury specifically is doing this on purpose, but there's more places in the application to write about your project if your impact is creating jobs. You have fewer characters to describe your projects if it's a homeownership project. And so one of our suggestions was, hey, can we just make that equal? That would help. They did not take us up on that. But other things, just socializing the idea, making sure that the reviewers who are actually, there's a first stage of review of applications before it goes on to the next stage, making sure those reviewers know a homeownership project that they're, reading about in the application is a completely fine, use of New Markets tax credits. When they're educating these reviewers, making sure that they know that is something that you can do with it, giving them examples of it in their training. Just little things like that can make a big difference, because if we in the industry, in the New Markets tax credit industry, if there are a lot of practitioners within our industry who don't think you can use, New Markets tax credits for home ownership projects, these reviewers that they have, definitely may not know that. So anything that we can get help on, just socializing that idea would be super helpful.
It's almost like the Treasury Department knew we were having our symposium
Yes,
today
and
wanted
they
to make
dropped
some
it so we could
announcements.
talk about it and thank them.
Yes,
Right,
yes,
publicly thank them.
absolutely. Yes, yes. Another reason why I wanted to hop to regs is because we got a question from the audience. They say, and this is for anybody, and I'm trying to think if I might have an answer too. In Philadelphia, our home repair grant program is funded with CDBG. We have been told that HUD regulations prevent them from providing home repair grants to equitable owners. I wonder if that means eligible owners. Their names are not on the deed, but we cannot find this restriction in the HUD regulations. Can anybody speak to this?
Do they mean the CDBG dollars going directly to?
Our home repair grant program is funded with CDBG funds.
I mean, there are HUD staff in this audience.
Not to put them on the spot.
That's what the beer and wine reception could be for, perhaps. And the CDBG was another rulemaking that took place this year too, that certainly NCST and many of our partners on this stage, we've done a combing through there as well. So it'll be good for us to keep in mind as we look at what those final resources could look like and what the owner-occupied repair space, what further easements there could be. And again, change administration means there's new audience to be able to hear what these concerns are, and I don't ever think that's a bad thing. One more piece on regs and just federal lawmaking in general. Sarah, the Supreme Court's overturning of the Chevron doctrine will have lots of implications on the future of federal lawmaking. Can you give us a high-level summary right before 5 p.m. On the decision, talk about what that means for both legislative and regulatory action? Because it's a big thing. It's going to mean a lot.
I love how Chevron just casually gets brought up at the end. Like, it did completely transform administrative law. Yeah, so in June, the Supreme Court overturned the Chevron doctrine, which previously established that when federal legislation is ambiguous, courts would defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation of the law, and this is no longer the case. And I can't remember the number, but there's been 70 court cases, ruled on this precedent. This is a really big deal. What will this lead to? This will lead to more power to courts and to Congress, so more litigation. It will lead to any new statutory language having to really be written in a way that accounts for this fact, the potential to revisit existing law, which I generally don't recommend when there is, the one benefit of divided government, it can be slower, but you have a balance, I think, of perspectives. And just in general, regulators and agencies are going to have to take a more cautious and risk-averse approach to regulations. This is going to have a tremendous impact across, all federal policy. I think we're seeing some immediate likely impacts in our space. The Community Reinvestment Act had a final rule introduced, and on my second week of my job, it was frozen in a lawsuit. And this was actually even before Chevron was overturned. But, I think it's a really classic policy example. When the Community Reinvestment Act was written, we didn't have online banks. And so it's really written around this concept about lending towards where you have these physical footprints and where you have branches. And we have this tremendous, industry movement towards online banking and entire firms that are only online, and what does that mean, and what are their requirements to get their CRA credit, and that's not written out in the original statute. It's very risky, I think, to go back to Congress and have them open it up. So there's also, I think, some need for regulatory clarity that's going to be drawn out now. But I think this is a really big deal, and just kind of big picture on this topic, though, I would say we absolutely know the next administration is going to come in with a culture of deregulation. They're going to pick up where they left off. But I think it's important for us to all remember that this, deregulation is not owned by a political party. That this administration has taken steps, as you've talked about in home, to streamline programs, to make them more efficient. I think there are differences in deregulation. There's those that really do try to ensure federal programs are as efficient and effective and as equitable as possible. And there are regulations that are in place to protect people, to protect renters and homeowners. And it's really important that we don't treat all deregulation the same. And I do encourage advocates, when they do engage the new administration, to also say regulatory changes are very disruptive to the market. For whether you're a nonprofit developer or you're a private lender, and you're dealing with banking regs, these changes, you have to steer your entire business and your teams around what are the new rules and how do we apply now and how do we comply. And so, I think we have to encourage where there has been progress made. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because it doesn't have your brand on it. Like, this was a step forward. And where's there room to do more? And I just think this is going to be a big theme the next 4 years.
Absolutely.
That is so true about sort of the market stability. You mentioned CRA, or you have Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank on the small business data disclosure. the banks were at our table saying, look, we'll report, just keep it consistent,
Yeah.
right? Like, we need to know what we need to do, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Are there any other kind of from your Pittsburgh, Western PA vantage point, Chris, are there specific programs or just other kind of anecdotal examples that you're seeing from the practitioner perspective when all these kind of regs are flying around? Any
Yeah.
examples you think might be salient
Well,
for this
no,
audience?
and I just go back to streamlining processes on federal applications, minus the CRA component, because again, that's sort of where our organization was founded upon. And my boss is on the NCRC board. He's very knowledgeable in CRA. We rely on groups like NCST and the Homeownership Alliance to really advocate on those federal regulations, because it's hard to keep up, right? I'm telling you, right?
We are happy to do it, and man, they make us work for it. So I think this is the last question. I haven't gotten the signal yet, but I know we're approaching 5 o'clock, and I don't want to stand too much longer between you all and wine. But I do want to talk about the importance of supply, because I think that is certainly how NCST and the Homeownership Alliance are seeing as the best, most efficient approach to find our way out of these housing affordability challenges. I know the word crisis gets used a lot. A member of mine will say a crisis kind of indicates a moment in time, just a singular moment in time. We've been seeing these challenges persist for much longer than a period of time that might be a crisis. I have yet to find like a punchier word that's like crisis. So next year I'll have one, so when y'all come back here, then I can tell you all about it. So homeownership specifically, it's been one of the major priorities, again, of both campaigns. We've had lots of recommendations, heard from the campaigns from both sides of the aisle on how to increase supply. We know the general election results. NCST's objective, again, is to educate and engage as many federal lawmakers, informed by our national partners, and most importantly, the Homeownership Alliance members that we represent, on how we can increase owner-occupied supply. So for you all, how might you explain the importance of a supply-side intervention to an audience that might see more down payment assistance as the only way to increase homeownership?
Yeah, I think we need demand side and supply side solutions, but I'm also still processing what I think we learned from this election, which is that, and this is maybe my personal hat on, not my NAL hat on, that Democrats struggled to communicate to voters. And so explaining supply and demand side economics does not seem to be effective messaging. I think we know from polls that voters really want direct cash, and that's why we saw a lot of proposals coming from both campaigns about that. But at the end of the day, if you get down payment assistance, which is very important, especially for first-time, first-gen aspiring homeowners, but there's no homes, there aren't inventory for modest or starter homes or just affordable homes on the market, it doesn't really matter. Not only that, but you'll see a huge amount of competition for those homes, and so you'll see the prices of those homes go up, which is why these demand-side solutions can actually have an inflationary impact if they're not balanced with supply-side investments. Again, we'll find a less wonky way to say that. But I think at the end of the day, you need both of these approaches. And as you said, we have to be able to walk and chew gum.
Yeah, I would, I think that Sarah made a really good point about thinking about the election, and, I was like, oh, it's a very simple story, and it is. I mean, not that I'm, despite being here, was never very good at economics, but, it's a very simple math problem if you really want to break it down that way as far as the supply issue. And so, you can try and tell that story many different ways and really localize it, when you're talking to folks, and use examples of how many homes that, are available and how many people need them. But that is, when you think about the kind of the political power of cash, of a direct assistance, that's kind of hard to come up against. But I think it's not going to solve the problem, but it is a very important piece of just the overall landscape. And, especially when we think about, closing the racial homeownership gap, and targeted down payment assistance is going to be very, very important. And so I think we can do both, but obviously pushing supply as at the forefront, and maybe just keeping it as simple as possible, and then maybe we worry about the really the nitty-gritty details more in kind of our smoke-filled rooms, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was excited, I know a lot of folks were excited when Vice President Harris laid out her plan on housing policy, and specifically called out a hard number, right? Like, we need 3 million more units. I don't, not that I speak for the other side, but I don't think the Trump administration would disagree with that number. There might be different ways to how to get there. But I also think it's not just a federal issue. I think state governments have an important place at the table. We have a very competitive governor in Pennsylvania who last couple budget addresses said, I like to compete with our neighboring states and beat them. Well, Ohio and New York, it's safe to say they had sort of better housing packages laid out by their legislators. He's taken a proactive approach this year, which is really exciting. At the local level, zoning reform is a big component of that, the puzzle to increase supply. And I also see, because again, our data showed and our research showed locally, a 10% increase in 10 years of corporate purchasing of single-family units. These folks are coming in with cash, quick, no mortgages. So now you're seeing philanthropy, government, banks, traditional financiers, compete with those interests. And so I think it takes everything to do that. So.
I would echo what everybody said. Obviously, it's the down payment assistance doesn't mean much if there's no place to buy a home. And if there's no place in a place where you want to buy a home. So many of the developers we see are developing in areas where there hasn't been investment for 30, 40 years. There's been no new construction there. But people grew up in these areas and they want to ultimately live there. So of course you need help with all of the things we've talked about. So down payment assistance is key, but you've got to have a supply in neighborhoods where people are happy to have that as their home, and then it creates that true economic development that we're all looking for.
And I think something that I continue to run into doing advocacy work is getting a question more and more of, why is it so expensive? Why are we in this situation? So while it's not excellent at all that we find ourselves in these dire affordability conditions, we are seeing that there is an answer in increased affordable supply. We are seeing what those mechanisms are based on the programs and the proposals you've heard on this stage today. So if you leave with anything, know that the future of affordable homeownership is not lost. It is not, the work does not stop. We've got a government now, just like we will in January, just like we did years ago, that we will need to engage, that we'll need to ignite, and that we'll need to advocate for. So please join us in whatever way you see fit. You've got lots of information about NCST, as well as our panelists up here. I want to thank you all for sharing your expertise. Thank you all for sticking it out. And I will welcome NCST President Chris Tyson back to the stage to close us out.
All right. How's everybody feel? Hopefully you have learned something here. There's been just an incredible sharing of knowledge, but also a lot of vision, a lot of commitment, and a lot of hope for the future and how we move forward. On behalf of the NCST staff, board, we want to thank you for participating in our second annual Homeownership Policy Symposium. The staff has worked extremely hard to bring today's events to you, and I just want to again recognize the NCST staff. Give yourself a round of applause. We also could not do any of the work we do without the community of dedicated and generous sponsors who make our work possible. You heard from Olivia Barrow Strauss with JP Morgan Chase, who's just been an incredible sponsor of ours. As you heard, we're so excited to have them. We started the day with our community buyer survey, which was supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we're very appreciative for their partnership and support. Today's symposium was made possible by the generosity of the Mortgage Bankers Association, Freddie Mac, and the Wells Fargo Foundation. So please give them a round of applause. If you still got some energy to hang out with us today, we welcome you to a reception occurring right on the other side of this door. We have some libations and some more food. We'd love to have you hang out with us and share some more. Thank you so much for participating today, and look forward to more from NCST.